Out in the Woods by Prozac 101. Hey, I just thought I'd share a couple of weird stories from my childhood, just to get everyone all hyped up for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old-fashioned farmhouse right on the fringe of the woods. It was kind of far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt pretty isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, and it was set in an area that had been uninhabited for 30 years before we started living there. Quite often, I was fairly rambunctious as a child, so while my mom was off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and just stay home all day. The big house had a habit of feeling, incredibly lonely and sparse. I spent most of my time playing in the forest and the expanses out back, some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't even hear my mother when she called. There was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another one, and an even larger trunk on its way down that was now just frozen there, forming this big arc over the forest floor. I would love to climb up that jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further. And, sometimes I had a habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on top of the fallen tree, which was a pretty good distance off the ground. Just listening to the birds singing and feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck. That's when I heard something strange from underneath me. It paralyzed me with shock. "Hey, kid!" I was gripped by a sudden and strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly beneath me. I strained to look down, but I couldn't see anything from over the ledge. For a long time, I sat there in just silence. And I was at the point to where I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the man's voice altogether. "I know you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time. I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a little bit higher, trembling nervously as I dug my fingernails into the bark, and I held tight like my life depended on it. I sat there trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see, the presence of this thing underneath me was still pretty clear. The bird song was much softer and more cautious this time. When I listened closely, I swear to God, I could hear the faintest echo of a human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all just my imagination, by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without falling off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out my arms long and peered over the edge, getting a full view of, the empty forest floor. When suddenly, "Come down here, or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud, it was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree and plunged off of the platform. I was saved by grabbing onto a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point that I had never, ever reached before. I sat there just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base of where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting that at any moment I would see someone crawling rapidly towards me up the pine. Instead, all I heard was the wind rustling some leaves above and below me, and the occasional little snippets of birdsong. It was, 2 hours before my mother came home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying on top of a fallen tree. Although this incident had both me and my mother pretty spooked, in time, however, we somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive hard skin of a child. Although, I never went as far into the woods as I used to. and never again did I approach that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and bringing it back in the house. It was a pretty tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk. You know, right when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that would usually coat the lawn. By the time I made my last round, I would sprint back to the house, pretty spooked. One of my least favorite things about the job, though, was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you've ever seen a barn owl's face stare at you in the dark corner of a roof, then you know just how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights, it got a little mistier than most. Mistier than I had ever seen it before. A thick silver fog covered everything, and it limited my line of sight to a small sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't that far from the house, I found myself feeling very disoriented, and more than once, I started to walk in the wrong direction. Both times, for some reason, I walked straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to even see my driveway. My eyes stung from the moisture and made my vision blur. Walking forward, I managed to walk head first, directly into a tree, doubling over and dropping all of the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a nice hard crunch. As I went to pick him up, with my foot throbbing pretty badly, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see below my knees. I decided to walk to the house. Since we had more than enough wood for one night, figured why not. However, it was getting pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I should go in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in every direction, trying to figure out any position I could in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into pine needles and trees and mud, and this crunching under my feet, instead of the dew-covered lawn which I should be on. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even see the shed anymore, cursing myself for being so dumb, while simultaneously trying to ignore my thumping heart rate and the sense that something else was at play. I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. I started screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume, but I was only met with this resounding silence from the depths of the mist that was all around where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a tree nearby. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped out piece of pink paper, and on it was an arrow, and it was pointing left. It looked vaguely like something my mom would make. I rationalized it that way anyway, just to keep me from getting lost. So, foolishly, I followed the direction set by the green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold of the night. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before I needed to stop and take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast, it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be, well, another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a really long nail, and it bored another arrow. But this one? It was pointing up. And a small sloppy note written on the side of it said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was so desperate to get the hell out of there, and my brow was frozen with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just make out dimly another spot of pink, up a little incline of stumps and litter. Well, by this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both of my eyes just to see a few feet ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, feeling out into the mist to try to see if I could find a tree. Although, I really was terrified of something grabbing my arm. I came across a third green note, which had an arrow pointing up again. This one led up an increasingly steep slope that I recognized as being nowhere near my house. And on the note was a really poorly drawn smiley face above it. At this point, I became way too freaked out to cope with anything. I started crying. As I slumped against a pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in the woods all night was really starting to sink in, like a syringe being driven into my veins. I caught a glimpse of another note in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by all of these notes, all of them looked fresh, by the way. No sign of decay despite the previous week's non-stop rain. I read the note from afar. What I read, it made my blood turn cold. Rocking on them in fear, my ears were sensitive to any little prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time I kneeled there, in the rolling fog, reading and rereading and rereading that horrible note over and over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to run off blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting out my face as I ran. What was written on the note? Well, in big green letters, it was just my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck like the decaying breath of something running right behind me. Somehow, some magical how, I made it back to my house. All of the lights were off and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. But when I found them, I bolted the doors and ran inside quickly, crawled into my bed where I remained unsleeping until morning. My mom just thought I had come inside and gone to bed. She hadn't even thought to leave the lights on for me. It was a miracle, or some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final, quote, incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she never experienced any of the weird shit in that house. Although we did mutually share the peculiar obsessive quality that the house's interior had on us, and its placement in these dreary, imposing woods. Although, obviously, I was never a really popular kid. By living out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else in my school, I was able to make some pretty tight friends over that first year of high school. One of those friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. Our night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured pizza, and we might have smoked a little pot. My mother went back home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at the time. It was roughly midnight when I received a pretty off-putting text from her in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" Almost immediately she responded, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded, no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message till about 3 a.m. She told me to go to my grandma's house in the morning and by any means not to dare go home. Honestly, I remember those bleak torrents of rain that day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns over. I'd been fighting the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, my grandma and her were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all the color had been drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor, after flinching because of the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until much later that night, when my grandma was finally sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This is the story of what happened when I was at Amanda's, as she described it in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat at the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset over the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware and vaguely irritated of a thumping noise near her head at the window. She went over to investigate. She saw these big brown moths that we often got at that place, buzzing madly into the grass. Reasoning that that was the cause of the sound, she just returned to her work. However, still feeling rattled in some way. It was only then that the noises started to get sharper and louder, that she paid more attention, and, well, she saw rocks were being thrown at the window from somewhere in the total blackness of the forest. She saw them appear from the shadows of the brush, then fall in a long arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she started to notice small cracks were forming from where the heavier ones had hit, right beside where her head had been a few minutes before. Momentarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were coming from. Then, with a startled rock, she jumped back from the window and saw me, standing half behind a tree near the window, grinning wide, staring at her. My one visible eye stretched open all the way, showing all of the white. She barely stifled out a scream seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or blink, but it was standing by one of the nearest pine trees, far from where the rocks were coming from. As they continued to do so in a loud downpour, my face continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking that it was all some kind of weird prank, hence the text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of this thing that looked like me, behind the tree, just started moving as if it were mouthing words silently, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side, seeming to talk to someone else behind the tree. My mom said it was someone who couldn't be seen, but what she could see was a formless black shape hanging out of the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring her way, and kept speed talking, then turning and whispering into the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start doing it again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she would suddenly point straight at my mom and start laughing. My mother screamed and fled to the bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself in at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window upstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she didn't feel safe. There was this awful smell and a weird humming noise from the walls. She tried to pray for a time before just giving up and listening to the rocks pelt the walls and the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct vibrant sound of a window actually smashing. Then this weird continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she said she could identify the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head to the closet, where that awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what looked like high-speed whispering. The closet door was only a couple feet from my mom. It started to open up slowly. In an unimaginable terror, she immediately got up and bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards. Before finally getting out, running out of the house, and completely keeping her eyes on the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said that she glanced back right at the end of the prolonged driveway, only to see two unmistakable human forms standing at the broken bedroom window, watching her as her car got further and further away from the house. That would be her final time there. She would never step foot in the place again. As my mother told the story, she broke down into tears. I don't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly fully believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only ever went back to that place once with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came up from another state to help us move. Mom had already found another place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up the truck of what was left there. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed the stuff from the empty place. I wish I could say that there was some closure or something, some final spooking to cap off what already wasn't there. But nothing happened. It was just a relief to be out of there. There was, however, only two things worth mentioning. We checked on the house for any signs of intruders. We found that several windows had been smashed and small rocks were laying on the floor. 2. My dad went out into the trees to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long that weird swing had been set up for. Needless to say, we never set up a swing, so I was pretty unsettled to discover that in the week since we'd been gone, someone assembled a rope swing and set it from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, right against where that falling log I stopped climbing many years ago. It was a pretty obviously new rope, and it was a nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from the recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable. Said that the neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did. We literally had no neighbors, at least in a mile in any direction. There were no houses at all in that space, and never in my time living there did I see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place, and we drove off. For the most part, I found it best to try to forget what happened there. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared to talk about it. But for a long time, I couldn't. Seeing as it's almost Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma recently sold the house to a new family. It was a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out. Despite my mother's desperate insistence that they'd just be left empty, now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, that fallen tree, the new occupants, and that new swing out back, gently swinging in the breeze as a little boy toddles obliviously towards it. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of my lovely patrons who are listed on screen right now. I've got a special story coming out for you in the next couple days. I hope you enjoy it. Dan R., Paul Z., Cody V., Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A., Dark Side of the Bear, Daniel H., and Maximilian Charles P. If you would like some Patreon-only content, a special one dropping in the next couple days like I just said, and other rewards just for being awesome, please sign up at the Patreon down below. Thank you.